Joining us now is Ashley Parker, staff writer at The Atlantic and an MS Now contributor, and who I just quoted, and Michael Feinberg, former FBI assistant special agent in charge and an MS Now national security and intelligence analyst. So, Michael, a Republican Congressman Michael McFaul, who was at Saturday's dinner, questioned why virtually the entire top line of succession was in that room together. Here's what he said.
You had the president and the vice president at the head table, both of them together, and the Speaker of the House. Had an explosive device gone off, you would have knocked out the president, vice president, speaker, the three in line of succession.
So are you saying they shouldn't be in public together?
Well, I think the Secret Service needs to reconsider having both the president and vice president together, like something like that, you know. Chuck Grassley would be the president had they all been taken out.
Is Congressman McCaul right? Is this something that should be reconsidered moving forward?
Well, I think it's only fair to point out that that's not actually up to the Secret Service. They can make recommendations for certain, but at the end of the day, the president, the protectees are able to override those recommendations, except in the most dire of circumstances. And I have to say, this is probably the only time I will ever go on record agreeing with Karoline Leavitt, but the Secret Service that night did do their job. There is this misconception that their responsibility is to an entire area or to an entire event. That is emphatically not the case, and quite frankly, it would make their jobs almost impossible. Their sole job is to protect the safety of the people to whom they are detailed. And as long as that final perimeter does not get breached and those individuals are able to be exfiltrated without incident, then they've done what's asked of them. We might not like that.
So let me ask you, does that suggest, though, that not that all security doesn't need to be tightened, that the blame may not go on the Secret Service, but when you look at the writing of the alleged gunman, the person who came in and who is now under arrest, he wrote at the end of his missive that he was shocked by how little security there was when he arrived there, that he was able to move around, that he comes in with multiple weapons and not a single person stopped him. So maybe not the Secret Service, but does there need to be a reconsideration then of security overall?
There are going to be trade-offs there. It's very important to note that at any event like this, any national security gathering or any mass gathering, all security can do is establish a series of perimeters and make sure that each one is more hardened than the previous. And there are always going to be two constraints against that: time and distance. You can only establish perimeters so far out, and the farthest out is always going to be the weakest. Think about how secure most airports are now by the time you get to the gate. That doesn't mean that the ticketing counter when you first walk in is going to be locked down as tight. At a certain point, you have to deal with the public and let them in. And the same goes for time. The shooter, the would-be assailant, checked into the hotel at a certain point in time before this event. Let's say that every single, guest at the hotel for the 3 days prior to the event had their luggage checked. There's going to be somebody who checks in 4 days beforehand. There's going to be somebody who visits 5 days beforehand and hides a weapon on the facilities to go back and get it later. It's weird for me to defend the agencies of our government under this administration, but nobody expects, particularly these days, for the Centers for Disease Control to wipe out the common cold and ensure that nobody ever gets the flu in the United States. The Secret Service actually has a better record at this event than many other agencies. And at the end of the day, like I said, their only job is to protect the president. We can talk about what we can do to make society as a whole safer, but I think that's a very different discussion than the one that's occurring now.
Well, there is another discussion, Ashley, that you brought up in your article, and you give some specific examples of, as the title says, who gets saved first. And there was the one video from Saturday night. It shows Secretary RFK Jr. shielded by security while his wife, Cheryl Hines, is kind of left to follow from behind. As this reality is settling in, who has security, at what level, who doesn't, are there people you're hearing from who think that this needs to change, that there needs to be a reconsideration of how all that works?
Well, in the immediate aftermath, as the adrenaline faded, one thing I was hearing from White House officials and others in that room is that this, in certain ways, felt different than the previous assassination attempts on President Trump, in part because it was not just, at least according to the suspect's alleged manifesto, geared at the president. He was the top target, but the suspect sort of went through and listed everyone he would have been happy to take out. And that included anyone who worked for the administration and junior staffers and people he viewed as complicit and people who do not have these Secret Service details. And there was a sense in that room. I was there as one of the people, everyone sort of dived under the tables. And there was a very clear understanding as we as journalists popped our heads up to try to understand what was going on, that as the different teams of Secret Service were racing in, they all had very specific targets, rightfully, who they were to protect and race out of there as quickly as possible. And if you were the spouse or you were a staffer or you were a senior staffer, but not one who had a detail, then you were going to be left to fend for yourself. And that was a reality, as I spoke with people Sunday, that was setting in among some people close to the White House and who worked in the administration.
So do you think this could give impetus, given that we just listened to Caroline Leavitt and we had heard from the president a couple of times, both in the press conference afterwards and then with 60 Minutes, that this will give impetus to the ballroom, that some of the people who have been saying we don't need the ballroom may now sign off on what the president's argument is that we need this for security reasons?
It's interesting. It's a very clear talking point that we saw emerge, in lockstep from the administration just hours, maybe not even hours, just an hour after the attempted shooting. So it's certainly something they're going to push, and they may have some real success with that message. I will say, for a number of complicated reasons, in part because this dinner is hosted by the White House Correspondents Association, which is an independent organization of journalists that cover the White House, that there's any number of reasons why this particular dinner, it would not make sense. It would not necessarily be appropriate for it to be held on White House grounds. But the president, who became more reticent after the Butler assassination attempt to do large rallies outside and doesn't like to go outside as much, according to people close to him, understandably may feel comfort in that ballroom, and the sorts of people who he is going to be around may also feel comfort in it. So it's certainly potentially an effective political talking point. I don't know that it would specifically apply to this dinner in future years.